Turning now to hagiography, the definition of which is a biography that treats its subject with undue reverence. Journalists occasionally serve up obituaries that are reverential. The U.S. news media produced a few of them last year. First, for the former senator and prisoner of war, John McCain. Then, for George H.W. Bush, the country's president from 1989 to 93, who died in November. Bush's obituary suffered from a syndrome that critics call Obit-omit, focusing on attributes and achievements, taking up column inches and television airtime, while controversial aspects of his record, among them alleged war crimes, were omitted. Such obituaries fail news consumers. See enough of them, and you'll find that they reveal more about the journalist producing them and the news outlet involved than they do about the deceased. The Listening Post's Daniel Turi now on the whitewashing of history in real time.
When Americans watch the news, they have a variety of channels to choose from across the political spectrum. But in the wake of a political death, it can be hard to spot the difference.
He was truly one of a kind.
On the 30th of November 2018, George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, died.
President Bush faced victory and defeat, tragedy and triumph with modesty, humor, and uncommon grace.
What a mind, what a heart, what a nice gentleman.
The wall-to-wall coverage was dominated by tributes that ranged from the admiring to the sentimental.
The former president remembered for his sense of decency, his kindness, and his commitment to others.
The coverage of George Bush Sr. In his death really emphasized personal qualities at the expense of policy.
Big question a lot of folks have been asking, what's next for Sully?
And even his dog, who, got more coverage than any dog since Lassie.
As we watched the pictures, we wondered aloud, is Sully just as sad as the humans who are missing this man so very much?
NBC did this, remarkable report by Jenna Bush Hager to a grandfather.
It's my turn to write a love letter to my Gamby.
I mean, one could take it as a sort of nice family tribute, but then why are they employing a journalist to cover her own family?
What do you want your legacy to be?
It has an effect of sort of depoliticizing Bush and making him, this kind of generic, lovable grandfather. You don't really get a sense of, this man was president. He made decisions that literally were life and death for hundreds of thousands of people.
I saw very little coverage of what he did politically. They were constantly talking about him being personable, having class,
decency, honor, integrity,
caring about his children, his grandchildren, and they have a place in talking about their loved one. But I think we have a responsibility in the media to go beyond that, to have an honest assessment of an absolutely critical period of U.S. history. We also have to remember the victims of his policies, the thousands of people who died in Panama, who died in Iraq, who didn't get a chance to write letters to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren.
When you look at how the American media covered George H.W. Bush, they reflect a kind of outlook that seems to be under siege. That is, country first.
At 19, he became the youngest Navy bomber pilot in World War II.
All the memories of George Bush's reaching across party lines, the fact that he wasn't a hater, all that, I think, accounts for the fact that the coverage was overwhelmingly, if not totally, positive.
This morning, we remember his life and his tremendous legacy.
When the eulogies did address Bush's record, they offered a somewhat starry-eyed view of his time in the White House.
What a great man George H.W. Bush was, and how he guided America and the world through the ending of the Cold War, how he reunified Germany.
The President of the Other, more controversial aspects of Bush's legacy were given short shrift. His 2 years as director of the CIA were glossed over, as were the invasions he launched as commander-in-chief. Against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1991.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
And in Panama to overthrow Manuel Noriega, a dictator who had previously been on the CIA's payroll when the agency was led by Bush.
His history as the head of the CIA in cultivating dictatorships in South and Central America, and his history in the illegal war against Panama should very well have been part of the obituaries.
George Bush, que le pida a Dios y que le pida mucho perdón por todo el daño que le ocasionó a muchos familiares aquí.
The so-called Gulf War of 1990-91 was really a different kind of scandal. The United States bombed Iraq mercilessly, started a process of destroying that country. There was a so-called highway of death where the Americans just mercilessly killed Iraqi troops that were in full-scale retreat. They used depleted uranium in their bombs and produced generations of young children born with cancer. If you don't add that into the legacy of George H.W. Bush, I don't know who you're talking about.
I don't think it's surprising that the analysis of the Gulf War was muted. I think part of what explains the relative quietness was the contrast between the Iraq War as George H.W. Bush fought it in Kuwait and what happened with his son. What Bush did not do, the elder, was to pursue that war into Baghdad. There was a sense of restraint. The second thing is that the old Latin expression, "do not speak ill of the dead," applies just in general to the media.
The Latin saying, de mortuis nil nisi bonum, or of the dead, say nothing but good, has been part of death etiquette in the West for centuries. But does it make sense as a rule of thumb for journalists when they assess a political legacy? Honoring a leader in death often means forgetting those who died as a result of their policies. And as with all rules, it's one that American news outlets often break when it suits.
If you actually look at the media as a whole, this principle, we have to respect the dead, is very selectively applied. And one can only look at sort of when Hugo Chavez died.
And they've been living under this horrible dictator. I don't think he will be missed by anybody.
The American media was not like, well, we have to think of his family and what was he like as a grandfather.
Provocative and unpredictable strongman of Venezuela has died.
No, it was all about, well, this guy was a tyrant, he had human rights abuses, it was very blunt. And so there's definitely like a different standard for American leaders as against sort of foreign leaders, especially those outside the Western world.
The glowing eulogies to George H.W. Bush hinted at a nostalgia that went beyond patriotism, and even beyond Bush himself. The repetition of words like decency and bipartisan seemed to be as much about what, or rather who, he was not.
I will build a great wall.
President Trump's open misogyny, xenophobia, and lying have outraged mainstream journalists. And his attacks on news networks have turned the media into an enemy.
That's enough. Put down the mic.
With Trump serving as a constant point of comparison, redemption in the media has never been easier to come by for former American statesmen,
George W. Bush,
whether they're dead or alive.
I'm so excited to have you here. Are you as excited as I am to be here?
Yeah, kinda.
Yeah.
The reason why George W. Bush looks better to a lot of the press is simply a matter of contrast.
President Bush, it's always nice to have you here in the studio. Thanks for joining us.
In the case of Donald Trump, you have somebody who simply has no concept of what truth or falsehood is, who violates norms, who's a bully, who's a lout.
I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
And so George W. Bush looks better by comparison.
You cannot compare things like that. You have to look at them as well for what they've done. And that's exactly what the media doesn't do. I mean, here's a direct war criminal, the man who has destroyed Iraq, based on an entire house built of lies.
Saddam Hussein is a threat to America. He's a man who said he wouldn't have weapons of mass destruction, yet he has them.
When he eventually dies, they're going to say, he was a decent man, he loved his children, he was a bipartisan. If they bring the illegal war in, it calls into question the American religion, that the American government acts benevolently around the world.
The media very much parrots the views of those in power. Sadly, journalists are a part of the establishment so much in the United States. It's hard right after a person dies to do an honest, real evaluation of their record, to speak ill of the dead. But journalism is the first draft of history. And it's at those moments that people come to understand their own country and our role in the world. And that's why the records of these presidents must be dissected, analyzed honestly. The key is not to erase what they've done.